Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 403. And this is a special episode. It is the fourth in my series of 5 under 20. And the idea of this series is, of course, to offer new collectors some ideas about picking up some undervalued early pressings of records from the classic period of modern jazz. Of course, I have another series which is about jazz, which is basically underappreciated and should come to greater notice, but those aren't necessarily bargains. This series is specifically focused on bargains. These are records which you should be able to find for a reasonable price online or at your local record store if you come across them. And specifically, there are certain criteria which I apply when I put these videos together. First of all, these are early pressings. They're not necessarily first pressings. They come from the first year or so of release, but I'm not getting hung up on first pressings because the more one finds out about collecting records, the more one realizes that what exactly is a first pressing can sometimes be problematic, especially with the passage of time. Secondly, there needed to be, on the day I made this video, which was January the 11th, 2025, at least 3 copies available on Discogs, 3 copies which were in very good plus condition, and 3 copies which were available for under $20. All 3 of those had to be true. So you had to be able to find 3 copies, VG Plus or better, for under 20 on Discogs. Now, that's not including shipping, that's not something I can control, but these are relatively value priced early pressings. So those are the rules. Now on with the records. And the first record I'm going to talk about is by a band called the Jazz Crusaders. Now the Jazz Crusaders were from the somewhat atypical jazz hotbed of Houston, Texas, and they had a band in high school. They were called the Swingers. They were playing, unremarkable gigs and kind of music of the day until Norman Grantz's Jazz at the Philharmonic came through town in 1955, blew them away, and a couple years later, after they finished high school, they all headed out to LA to make their fortune in the jazz world. They had a flute player at the time, Hubert Laws, who left the band and went on to solo career really of some repute over the next decade or two. It wasn't some kind of heinous split up. They just went their separate ways. But the other 4, Stix Hooper, the drummer, Wayne Henderson, the trombonist, Wilton Felder, the saxophonist, and Joe Sample, the piano player, stuck together for the next, well, multiple decades actually. And they had as a foursome a very recognizable sound, which you can find on so many of their records on Pacific Jazz in the 1960s, which was, if anything, hard bop. It was hard bop, quite heavily influenced by the blues and quite heavily influenced by soul music and by contemporary black pop. But it was not what I would call soul jazz in the way that Shirley Scott is soul jazz, or the way that Gene Ammons is soul jazz, or the way that Jimmy Smith is soul jazz. It's a little bit, it has more what you might call bop integrity to the music. It's a little bit less corny, if you will. And what's really characteristic of this group is the sound of the front line, Wilton Felder's tenor saxophone and Wayne Henderson's trombone, particularly the trombone. As time goes by, they do, through the 1960s, get more and more influenced by other streams of black music, and in and around 1970, they reinvent themselves. They drop the jazz from their name and they become the Crusaders, and they become a pretty righteous jazz funk outfit all the way through the 1970s, dropping what we would now refer to as fat beats. Anyway, this record is kind of at the end of their Jazz Crusaders phase. You can see they're posing on the beach outside the Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach in the southern part of LA. They look like a kind of a premonition of a United Colors of Benetton ad. Someone's certainly been wardrobe shopping for the group. Inevitably, on this record, as was a general tendency at the time, given the dire straits that jazz was in by the late 60s, there's a high profile pop cover. In this case, the Beatles' Get Back, which leads off the record. But I would say that's not too bad, first of all. And secondly, every other track on this record is much stronger. In particular, Henderson's trombone sound over that hard grooving rhythm section is routinely excellent. Great live energy from this club date, really closely mic'd and quite an intense sound at the Lighthouse. It's a great record. Pick it up. Okay, here is another record which you could have gotten today for 20 bucks or less on Discogs, and it is this one by Jimmy Giuffre, who is another jazz musician from Texas. This is only his second album as a leader. It's made for Capitol. It comes out in 56. It's recorded in the summer of 55. And I'm always kind of amazed that this record gets made because it's not as if Jimmy Giuffre was an unknown. He certainly wasn't. He had come to some notoriety playing for, I think it was Woody Herman, in a big band context, had some degree of national exposure as part of all that. But this is only his second record as a leader, and it is a really non-commercial jazz record for 1956. Now, don't get me wrong, the music is good, but it's what I would call West Coast experimental. It's not cool jazz of the highly arranged and soothing kind that some of his peers were playing. It wasn't the kind of hot bop infused jazz that other people, like, say, Art Pepper, were playing on the West Coast at the time. It's altogether something much more reserved. It's almost folkish in some ways, and it kind of presages Giuffre's move into more experimental stuff, third stream stuff as we go into the 1960s. It's also, in a non commercial way, a pianoless and an almost drumless quartet. There are drums here, played by a guy called Artie Anton, about whom I know not much else. But the drums don't make much of an impact. Primarily, it's a conversation between Jimmy Giuffre's reed instruments, Ralph Pena's bass, and Jack Sheldon's trumpet. If you're familiar with the work of George Russell, or maybe Dwayne, I think it's Tatro, maybe Tatro, but I think Tatro, or perhaps the record that Shelley Mann and Jimmy Giuffre made called The Three, which was another kind of experimental record made for contemporary, that should, I think, prepare you for this. And I'm recommending it. It's a very interesting record, and you can get it for cheap. But I won't go so far as to say it's a hard swinging record because it certainly isn't. All right, the next record I'm going to talk about is also one that's got some degree of West Coast connection that wasn't necessarily intentional, just kind of how things are working out. This is Les McCann playing in his group, his trio at the time, Les McCann Limited. It's a live record that he makes in San Francisco in 1961. Now, Les McCann is actually from another not really jazz associated place, Kentucky. He's a self taught piano player. He ends up on the West Coast for a couple of reasons. One is his Navy service, also his educational pursuits. And in the late 1950s, he starts up his own trio and he's playing in the Sunset Strip. And they're a pretty good trio. And amongst other people, Miles Davis hears them and recommends them to Cannonball Adderley, saying, here's a great piano player for your group. But McCann ends up turning down that opportunity and sticks with his trio and signs with Pacific Jazz. He makes his debut for them, I think, in 1960. I think this is his second record for Pacific. And again, it's a live record made at the Jazz Workshop in San Francisco, which was the place where just a year before Cannonball had made what turned out to be basically the first ever live in a club jazz LP. I really like this record, and I think what stands out for me is something which is quite different than what McCann became more famous for later on, which was his, funky stylings and interpretations and his vocals and so on. Here, it's a different set of stylings that really attracts me to this record. And that's the way in which he's able to create all kinds of moods and textures with his piano. He's almost like the Brian Eno of the keyboards here. And that's in particular true of a track, what's it called again? Red Sails in the Sunset. But not just that track as well, but it really is atypical jazz piano. It's piano creating textures and moods and feelings and not simply either comping or soloing or playing a head arrangement or what have you. There's plenty of variety on this record too, and just like the Jazz Crusaders record, there's lots of club ambiance which really adds to things, so do check this one out. Now, the fourth record I'm going to talk about today is by another jazz musician from an atypical jazz origin. In this case, it is Cannonball Adderley, who, of course, hailed along with his brother from northern Florida. This is his record Plus from 1961 on Riverside. Now, Cannonball made an absolute ton of music in the first decade of his serious career between, say, 1955 or 56 and 1965. A large chunk of that for Emercy earlier on, and then a whole bunch of records for Riverside, of which this is one. And it's interesting to me that I'm actually recommending an early, maybe even an original pressing on Riverside, because normally those would be so expensive you couldn't imagine you'd get one for $20 for something pressed around this time. But somehow or other, Cannonball's music, I think, is a little bit undervalued for whatever reason. I suppose if he'd been recording for Blue Note, things would have been different, and this might have been priced out of anybody's reach, but he wasn't, and so it isn't. Now, this is the band, and I'll just mention the band. It's his brother Nat on cornet. He, of course, Cannonball is playing alto sax. Victor Feldman is playing vibes, the British former child prodigy and multi-instrumentalist. Wyn Kelly is the plus person on this record. He's somebody who, of course, was known to Cannonball from their time together with Miles Davis. He's a piano player. And then you've got his Cannonball's regular rhythm section of Sam Jones on bass and Louis Hayes on drums. And as I recall, the purpose of having Kelly in this record is that sometimes Feldman switches from piano to vibes, and therefore they need a piano player. This record also has one of my all-time favorite jazz photos on the back. If I can make sure the camera focuses on it. I love it because Cannonball's waist looks about 2 feet higher than his brother Nat's waist. Something about those high-waisted 1950s pants. Anyway, there's an awful lot to like about this record, which, like the other records I've mentioned, has a lot of variety, including Cannonball doing his best Charlie Parker impression on the bebop classic Well You Needn't. Although my personal favorite on this record is actually a Victor Feldman composition. It's the last track on side one called New Delhi. Just beautiful, beautiful stuff. Anyway, another one to look for. Now, the last record I want to talk about is by Herbie Mann, that sexy as I want to be jazz chameleon who moved through all kinds of jazz styles and subgenres over the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. This is a bossa nova record, obviously. Now, there are a lot of American jazz musicians who made bossa nova records between 1962 and 1965. Some of those are very good. Some of them are really terrible. And Herbie Mann actually has made both. Well, I won't say he made a terrible one, but he made a much poorer one about a year before called Brazil, Bossa Nova, and Blues. And this one is infinitely better. Well, why is that? Well, for the same reason which separates a lot of the good ones and the bad ones in this period. This one, Herbie goes down to Brazil and he actually plays with proper Brazilian musicians who know the bossa nova rhythms and are able to bring not just an air of authenticity, actual authenticity, as you'll hear when I talk about the people that play in this record. His previous record, and this was something of which a number of other jazz players were guilty, was made with a rhythm section with a bunch of guys with Spanish last names, and they figured, close enough. But these were people who were used to playing Latin music, but not used to playing the bossa nova, which doesn't necessarily have the same family tree or origin or paternity as a lot of Latin music, because it was innovated as a fusion of bebop and Brazilian rhythms by just a few people in Rio in the latter part of the 1950s. So Herbie's record, Brazil, Bossa Nova, and Blues, is not very good. It's also like a record that a guy called Paul Winter made. I think it's called maybe The Sound of Bossa Nova. Anyway, it's a record he makes when he hears the Bossa Nova and he goes home and he makes a record with his sextet in New York, which really is just very lame. He then later on goes back down to Rio and makes a record with Carlos Lira called The Sound of Ipanema, which is fantastic. Same kind of story here. So Mann has gone down to Rio, and here are the people he's playing with. Baden Powell, the very super talented Brazilian guitarist. He's playing with Sergio Mendes, the piano player and future band leader, the guy that brought us some Mashkinada and all kinds of other swinging bossa nova slash pop crossover stuff in the later 60s. And no less a person than Antonio Carlos Jobim is actually arranging and conducting and also singing on this record to boot. So again, Mann has gone right to the source, and really he's one player in a constellation of excellent players, and he's contributing his piece. Certainly, he's central in this record, but he's by no means trying to imagine up what a bossa nova record sounds like, which is what he had done on his previous release. Without going through it track by track, the results on here I think are spectacular. It's one of the great early American-led bossa nova records, and thankfully, because it's on a big label like Atlantic, they printed tons and tons of copies, so it's very easy to find an early pressing for not too much money. Highly recommend this one, perhaps of all five of the ones I've talked about today. So hurry out there, see if you can find it, and do enjoy when you do. So that's it for this edition of 520. I hope you enjoy those recommendations. And again, if you go looking, you find that they actually now cost more than $20. Well, there may be some kind of YouTube intervention effect in play there, but all I can say is they were available for that money when I looked this morning. Thanks very much for watching. I look forward to your comments, and we'll see you next time.